Hakeem Jeffries has already declared that we are losing the war. I have never heard a Speaker of the House, more correctly, a would-be Speaker of the House, God forbid if he is Speaker of the House, a would-be Speaker of the House declare we're losing the war. If that's not giving aid and comfort to the enemy, that's not trying to sabotage the war effort and dispirit the men and women who are fighting and dispirit the American people, I don't know what is. It shows how evil and diabolical these people are. Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Liberty's Voice, our brand new video podcast. I want to thank you for watching, sharing it with friends and family and as many people as you can. We're off to a great start. And this is program number, what is it, folks? Number 9? Already we've done 9. But I want to thank you. We want to build it as big as we can. We want to mesh it with radio and TV and build a juggernaut for the midterm elections in 2028, should we last that long. And we're going to need your help as the activists, as the patriots that you are. You're hearing a lot of debate about war powers, something called the War Powers Act of 1973. You're hearing Democrats say that the president's war, quote unquote, is unconstitutional. You're hearing Democrats, media figures say he needed to come to Congress first. These are all lies. You're not going to become the smartest person anywhere you go on this constitutional issue. Who has the power to make war? What is or is not constitutional? And does the president have to go to Congress to get authorization? I made it as simple as possible so even a liberal Democrat can understand. So here we go. Fact: no president of either party has accepted the constitutionality of the 1973 War Powers Act. Not Obama, not Biden, not Clinton, and no Republican. Every president has viewed it as a violation of separation of powers. The president's Article 2 plenary, broad, general power to run foreign policy, and his authority as the commander-in-chief. Fact: the Supreme Court has never ruled on the act's constitutionality and likely never will. Indeed, Congress itself is split on the issue, with Democrats supporting Democrat presidents and Republicans supporting Republican presidents. The War Powers Act is nothing but a political tool used by members of Congress, typically against a president of the opposite party, and their arguments mostly switch from one side to the other depending on who the president is. Fact: the first draft of the Constitution, which I'll delve into in a minute, provided that Congress would have the power to make war. To make war. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention, August of that year, when they met, they rejected that language. They rejected it and changed it to declare war, intentionally watering it down because they did not believe a body with numerous members were institutionally capable of making such decisions. So make war, which is what the Democrats are arguing today, was specifically rejected. Fact: to declare war does not result in making war. To declare war does not result in making war. For example, if Congress were to declare war and a president refused to accept such a declaration, Congress can't force the commander-in-chief to execute such a war. Congress declaring war, which it has done a mere 11 times, mostly during World War II, and the last time 1942, that's more than half a century ago, it's almost a century ago, is essentially the highest means by which Congress can proclaim its support for a war. It is not a condition precedent to making war and never has been. Fact: the only power Congress has to prevent a military operation is the power of the purse to withhold money. That said, a president who is commander-in-chief, who has authorized military action, he's not going to sign a bill that then prevents him from executing that war. He's not going to do it. Therefore, Congress would need a 2/3 majority of both houses to override his veto of a spending bill, or in that case, a bill that limited spending. In other words, a president has broad power to take military action. Fact: other than the vice president, the president is the only federal official elected by the entirety of the people, by the entire nation. In addition to the institutional impossibility of war powers and decisions in the hands of a multi-member body like Congress, the president is the only official who was elected to, among other things, serve as commander-in-chief. Now, these bullet points, these factual points, make it very, very easy to follow what's taking place despite all the lies that are coming into your home through TV and podcasters and radio, despite all the lies that this is an unconstitutional war, despite all the lies that the president has to bow at the power of Congress before he can take action, despite people running around talking about the War Powers Act of 1973, which no president has accepted as constitutional, but they've insisted it's a violation of presidential powers under Article 2, and the Supreme Court has never ruled on it and never will. Now let's dig a little bit deeper, shall we? I think we shall. Let's look at Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention. What did they say about war powers? What did they do exactly? Well, I'm going to read it to you as Madison wrote it. Mr. Pinckney opposed the vesting of this power in the legislature. Remember, the first draft said, Congress shall make war. Its proceedings were too slow, he said. Congress meets but once a year. At least then, that was a good time. The House of Representatives would be too numerous for such deliberations. The Senate, he said, would be the best depository, being more acquainted with foreign affairs and most capable of proper resolutions. Pinckney said if states are equally represented in the Senate, so as to give no advantage to large states, the power will notwithstanding be safe, as the small have their all at stake, I'm reading as it's written, in such cases, as well as the large states. It would be singular for one authority to make war and another peace. Delegate Butler, Mr. Butler, the objections. The legislature lie in great degree. The Senate, he was for vesting the power in the president, who will have all the requisite qualities and will not make war, but when the nation will support it. His point was the president was elected by all the people. He should be the commander-in-chief, not Congress with all these disparate individuals. And then, of course, as a practical matter, you have votes, right? And what if it's a really close vote? So some congressman from one state, one district in one state, or maybe a handful of them, a faction, a cabal, will determine whether we go to war or not. So they were very concerned about all this power being in Congress, and you can see how prescient they were. Look at what's going on today. Mr. Madison and Mr. Geary moved to insert declare, striking out make war. Declare war, not make war. And in Madison's notes themselves, declare is italicized and make is italicized to emphasize the point that they want to swap out make for declare. And I go on, Madison's notes, leaving to the executive the power to repel sudden attacks. Now, people will hang on the word sudden, but ladies and gentlemen, this was way back at the beginning of the Republic. There weren't nuclear weapons, there weren't missiles, there weren't tanks. In other words, modern warfare is fast, 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 and it's not something that can be repelled necessarily right away. Mr. Sherman thought it stood very well. The executive should be able to repel, but not commence war. Make better than declare, the latter narrowing the power too much. So he's saying, look, it's okay for the power of the president to move suddenly, but I don't like this word declare. It waters down make too much. Mr. Gerry never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war. Mr. Ellsworth, there is a material difference between the cases of making war and making peace. It should be more easy to get out of war than into it. War also is a simple and overt declaration, peace attended with intricate and secret negotiations. Now, he raised that, which is interesting, but not terribly relevant to aspect of the debate, so who makes war and who does not. Mr. Madison agreed to giving the power of war to the executive because not safely to be trusted with it, or to the Senate, because not so construed as to be entitled to it. He was for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace. He preferred declare to make. So Madison's of two minds on this. He says, look, I don't want a president who's too powerful, but on the other hand, this idea that Congress would make war is crazy, because we'll never win a war, or we'll never take action we need to take. And so they said, all right, let's take make out, put in declare, and then later, of course, under Article 2, they give the power of the president. Basically, it's plenary. In other words, all-consuming, to run foreign policy and national security, and commander-in-chief. So that's the decision that's made. So how did the vote take place? New Hampshire voted no. Massachusetts abstained. Connecticut voted no. Pennsylvania voted aye. Delaware voted aye. Maryland voted aye. Let's see here. Virginia voted aye. North Carolina voted aye. South Carolina voted aye. Georgia voted aye. One of the states isn't there. One of the 13, it's because they weren't there. The delegates weren't always there. And so it is. Now let's go on. How is this explained? By the National Constitution Center. In its reporting containing the first full draft of the Constitution considered at the Constitutional Convention, the Committee of Detail included a provision granting to Congress the power to make war, quote unquote. The assignment of this power to Congress and the clause's phrasing, which differed from its counterpart in the Articles of Confederation, prompted debate among the delegates. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina made the first remarks about the clause, as you heard from my raw reading of it. He objected to including the House of Representatives in the power to make war because he believed it to be too large a body for the quick deliberations necessary for the task. The Senate alone would be a better option, he said, because it would be more acquainted with foreign affairs and more capable of proper resolutions. Pinckney also argued that because both small and large states face existential risk from war, the composition of the Senate with its equal representation of the states made it a more appropriate body. Pierce Butler of South Carolina voiced an objection to either chamber of Congress being assigned the power to make war. Butler advocated instead for, quote, vesting the power in the president, who will have all the requisite qualities and will not make war but when the nation will support it, as you see from the raw reading. After Butler's comments, James Madison of Virginia and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts moved to change the clause to give Congress the power to declare war rather than make war. According to Madison's notes, the change was intended to leave to the executive the power to repel sudden attacks. Roger Sherman spoke in opposition to the motion, contending that substituting the term declare would narrow congressional authority too significantly. But it did narrow congressional authority, even though he disagreed with it. It narrowed it enormously. Sherman argued that the original term make better captured the formulation in which the president was empowered to repel attacks but could not commence war on his own. They rejected that. At this point, Elbridge Gerry objected to Butler's earlier raised proposition that the clause be shifted to a presidential power. That's right. So this is authority that rests in Article 1 under Congress. But then in Article 2, the president is the commander-in-chief. He's in charge of foreign policy and national security. So when you read those together, it's pretty clear that the president has this authority, and Congress only has the power of the purse. Gerry remarked that he never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war. And remember, that's a quote, the president's not declaring war. He's literally making war. And that war can be a defensive war in reaction to another power, an enemy, or it can be a preemptive war, as we see right now, because of threats from Iran. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut spoke next and highlighted the distinction between making war and making peace. To Ellsworth, it should be more easy to get out of war than into it. George Mason then responded to the several lines of argument that had been raised in response to the motion to substitute declare for make. Mason maintained that the president could not be trusted with the power of war, and that the Senate was not so constructed as to entitle it. Mason endorsed the view that the Constitution should facilitate the process of making peace while making it more difficult to engage in war, and he concluded by stating that he preferred the phrase declare over make war. So what do we get out of Mason? Pretty much like Madison. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. They want the power of the president to basically run a war, lead a war, to be the commander-in-chief. They are concerned about that power, but they are more concerned that giving that power to Congress is a disaster. And so they voted to change make war to declare war. And again, they would later, in Article 2, give this authority of national security, foreign policy, and commander-in-chief to the president. The delegates then voted on the motion to substitute declare for make. 2 rounds of votes were held, and although the records of the Constitutional Convention provide inconsistent accounts of the first round of voting, the motion passed on the second vote with 8 states in favor and 1 against. That means 4 states either didn't have enough delegates there or they didn't participate. But typically, they would vote present if they were there and they didn't agree. And so it's believed the second round of voting was more accurately recorded, that Madison's notes may have mistakenly had it as a closer vote, 5-4 in favor, and they took a vote again, and then it became 8-1. So I wanted to point that out, but let's go even deeper. Deeper, that's what we do here. There was an excellent piece written some years ago, 2012, the War Powers Resolution, still an unconstitutional, unnecessary, and unwise fraud that contributed directly to the 9/11 attacks by Robert Turner. Robert Turner is a well-known, or was a well-known scholar in this area, who was also more than a scholar. He was involved in this area on Capitol Hill and the White House and in other places. And he wrote about this in the School of Law, Case Western Reserve University, a fantastic law school. And in part, he says, look, the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. To understand the separation of constitutional powers regarding war and the use of military force, we need first of all to appreciate the importance of Article 2, Section 1, which grants to a president, quote unquote, a president of the United States, the nation's executive power. Today, Americans read that clause and assume it conveys merely the power to execute the laws and policies established by Congress. But that was not the understanding of the men who wrote the Constitution during the summer of 1787. They understood executive power as the term used by Locke, Montesquieu, and Blackstone, whose writings were often referred to as the political Bibles of the framers. Each of these writers viewed what Locke described as the business of war, peace, leagues, and alliances to be the province of the king, prince, or magistrate, the executive officer of the government, as they put it. How do we know the Founding Fathers embraced this view? Because they repeatedly told us so in clear terms. Writing in June 1789, Representative James Madison explained, quote, the executive power being in general terms vested in the president, all powers of an executive nature, not particularly taken away, must belong to the department. The following year, Madison's friend and mentor Thomas Jefferson wrote in a memorandum to President Washington the following: the Constitution has declared that the executive power shall be vested in the president, submitting only special articles of it to a negative by the Senate. In other words, there's a few instances, very few in the Constitution, where the president shares power or Congress has the power to negate something that the president does. As an example, the treaty clause. The president has to present a proposed treaty to the Senate. And a supermajority of the Senate, 3/4 of the Senate, has to adopt it to have a treaty. The transaction of business with foreign nations is executive altogether. Now remember who this is. This is Madison writing to Washington. It belongs then to the head of the department, except as to such portions of it as are specifically submitted to the Senate, the treaty clause. Exceptions are to be construed strictly. So this is Madison's view 2 years later, in 1789. These exceptions include the Senate's negatives on treaties and diplomatic appointments, as well as the power of Congress to declare war. President Washington discussed Jefferson's memorandum with Chief Justice John Jay and Representative Madison, recording in his diary 3 days later that both agreed with Jefferson that beyond these enumerated exceptions, the Senate had, quote, no constitutional right to interfere, unquote, in the business of diplomacy, quote, all the rest being executive and vested in the president by the Constitution, unquote. These are original documents. These are original statements and quotes. Jefferson's chief rival in Washington's cabinet, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, took an identical position in 1793. Quote, the general doctrine then of our Constitution is that the executive power of the nation is vested in the president, subject only to the exceptions and qualifications which are expressed in the instrument. It deserves to be remarked that as the participation of the Senate in making of treaties and the power of the legislature to declare war are exceptions out of the general executive power vested in the president, they are to be construed strictly and ought to be extended no further than is essential to their execution. No further. No activist interpretations of things like declare war. Yet another key Jefferson rival, and he was a big rival, Chief Justice John Marshall reaffirmed the president's independent constitutional responsibilities in the field of foreign affairs, and perhaps the most famous of all Supreme Court decisions, Marbury versus Madison. Now, what did he say that's relevant? And I quote, by the Constitution of the United States, the president is invested with certain important political powers, in the exercise of which he is to use his own discretion and is accountable only to his country in his political character and to his own conscience. Whatever opinion may be entertained of the manner in which the executive discretion may be used, still there exists and can exist no power to control that discretion. The subjects are political, they respect the nation, not individual rights, and being entrusted to the executive, the decision of the executive is conclusive. John Marshall. Marshall illustrated this principle by mentioning the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, later the Secretary of State, as we call them, and declaring that the acts of that officer, quote, can never be examined by the courts. So when the Constitutional Convention gave executive power to the president, the foreign relations power was the essential element it granted him. Very specific, very forceful is the language. In addition to understanding the vast grant of executive power to the president with respect to foreign affairs, we must also recognize that the constitutional framers intentionally limited the authority of the legislature over the business of war. As I pointed out, we talk about the original draft, make war versus declare war. The concept of a declaration of war was a term of art from the law of nations, and such instruments were only considered necessary when a nation was about to launch an all-out aggressive attack against a nation with which it was at peace. The framers understood the concepts of perfect and imperfect war, and also of force short of war. Throughout our history, Congress has formally declared war 11 times involving 5 wars. But as the Supreme Court noted, and this is in 2000, the United States frequently employs armed forces outside this country over 200 times in our history for the protection of American citizens or national security. To mention one early example, President Thomas Jefferson ordered 2/3 of the new American Navy to sail for the Mediterranean in March 1801 with the orders to protect our commerce and sink and burn the ships of any Barbary states, that they should learn that declared war on America without even formally informing Congress until his December 8, 1801 State of the Union report. And the annals of Congress reveal no expression of concern that the president should first have obtained prior legislative action. So here we are in 1801, the Barbary pirates are seizing our ships, and by the way, Europe ships. They're enslaving American sailors. They're demanding ransom fees and so forth, or they would murder them. John Adams, our second president, was trying to pay them off and so forth. Jefferson said, no, we're not doing that. We're going to put an end to this. And he ordered 2/3 of the Navy to go there, and obviously in a war to destroy them, which is what they did. The great publicists in the international law, Hugo Grottens and Emmerich de Vattel, noted that formal declarations of war were not necessary when a nation was, as Grottens put it, repelling an invasion or seeking to punish the actual author of some crime, Vattel added that he who is attacked and only wages defensive war needs not to make any hostile declaration. Other scholars have made similar statements. Many things have changed in the 225 years since the Constitution was drafted. Well, we can add more time to that, can't we? 13 more years. And some of the powers vested in Congress have little contemporary relevance. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution vested in Congress the power to declare war and grant letters of marque and reprisal. But, Turner writes, I would submit that both are now anachronisms. The use of letters of marque and reprisal was outlawed by the 1856 Declaration of Paris. They have not been granted by the United States since the War of 1812. Similarly, the types of all-out offensive, that is, aggressive wars historically associated with formal declarations of war, were outlawed in principle by the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which we discussed the other day, and again by the UN Charter in 1945. No country in the world has issued a declaration of war in more than 65 years. No country in the world. And we haven't issued a declaration of war since 1942. That's 84 years ago. Congress has every right to refuse to approve requested appropriations for forces or supplies, and thus can indirectly undermine virtually any major commitment of U.S. military forces in the hostilities. So, in other words, what I said earlier is the power of the purse. Now, in this instance, what he's explaining is Congress doesn't have to authorize it. Now, if Congress were to affirmatively try to pull back funds it already authorized to the Pentagon, as an example, or the CIA, to try and thwart a military action or campaign, that would be almost impossible, given the president would have to sign that, and they would have to override it with a veto. But what is being said here is, when the time comes, depending on the timing of the military action, Congress can sit on its hands and say, oh, we're not authorizing that, which is true. But a narrowly construed power to declare war does not carry with it legislative authority to prevent the president from using whatever military Congress creates to safeguard the nation against both foreign threats and acts of aggression, or to see the laws faithfully executed. Put simply, the power to declare war does not equate to the power to limit the introduction of United States Armed Forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances as asserted in the War Powers Act. Particularly outrageous of that law is Section 2C3 of the statute, which pretends to limit the president's constitutional power to protect American civilians abroad or on the high seas. Section 2 reads, the constitutional powers of the president as commander-in-chief to introduce U.S. armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances are exercised only pursuant to, one, a declaration of war, and it goes on. In other words, only Congress can agree to that. And if it doesn't, he can't do it. And he's saying, that is bull. That is absolute baloney. You and I also know that a statute cannot amend the Constitution. This is a backdoor amendment to the Constitution where a Democrat-led Congress tries to seize power from President at that time Nixon over the Vietnam War. If they really believe they had, the public will behind them, then they should have gone through either of the constitutional processes to change the Constitution. Instead, they passed a statute. Nixon vetoed it. They overrode it. The Vietnam War had become unpopular. They wanted to end it. And Nixon, and then later Ford, wanted to continue it. But the Congress said no. Ultimately, what did Congress do? They withheld funds. They withheld the funds. They used the power of the purse, which they had the power to do. That's right. In the December 1984 debate with Senator Jacob Javits, the principal sponsor of the War Powers Resolution, before the American branch of the International Law Association, this author, Turner, noted that the exclusion of civilians from the final clause of the provision were clearly unconstitutional, and he goes into the specifics and so forth. So the War Powers Act, to me, is clearly unconstitutional. And the Democrats are trying to use it to sabotage this military campaign. And we know that because of the language that's being used by the likes of Hakeem Jeffries. Hakeem Jeffries has already declared that we are losing the war. I've never heard of a Speaker of the House in the middle of a military campaign, call it a war, call it whatever you want, declaring while our troops, our heroic men and women in uniform, are fighting for we, the people of the United States, I have never heard a Speaker of the House, or more correctly, a would-be Speaker of the House, God forbid if he is Speaker of the House, a would-be Speaker of the House declare, we're losing the war. If that's not giving aid and comfort to the enemy, that's not trying to sabotage the war effort and dispirit the men and women who are fighting and dispirit the American people, I don't know what is. It shows how evil and diabolical these people are. Jeffries, Schumer, every single Democrat in the House that I can think of, bar one or two, every single Democrat in the Senate, bar Fetterman. We've reached a point in our country where we literally have one political party that roots for the enemy. And don't tell me that's not true. They're rooting for the enemy. The language that they use, the phony arguments that they're trying to throw in front of the President of the United States, they don't even say anything positive. Wow, what a spectacular campaign so far. Our men and women are the best on the face of the earth. Our military is the best on the face of the earth. We've invested in cutting-edge technology that's making a difference. I mean, our warships, our jets, our bombers, our equipment is second to none. This is a fantastic campaign. We've taken out Khomeini. Khomeini, a mass murderer, the Hitler of the Middle East. We took him out in 15 hours with our great allies, the Israelis, their great leader, the Prime Minister, Netanyahu, their pilots. You know, CENTCOM put out a statement yesterday. You know what they said? The two greatest air forces on the face of the earth, the United States Air Force and the Israeli Air Force. You now have more information about your Constitution, about the Constitutional Convention, what the delegates actually said, about the power to make war versus the power to declare war. You understand their arguments. You've heard from one of the great scholars on this topic, and of course you've heard from me. And this is very, very important. This is why I've decided to do Liberty's Voice in this video podcast, because we can move quickly to jump on issues and to give it the kind of attention I think it needs, a historic context, a constitutional context, because you're basically hearing people yelling at each other, yes it is, no it's not, yes it is, no it's not. And you can watch this and replay it and take notes if you wish. If you wish, get involved in the battle of ideas. Get involved in this. The fact of the matter is you now know more than almost anybody else. The president has absolutely the constitutional authority doing exactly what he does. And the effort by Congress to sabotage him, whether it's the War Powers Act or these claims that he had to come to them first, are exactly that, efforts to sabotage him. Spread the word. Share the video podcast. Tell your friends. Tell as many people as you can. We need to push back. We need to save the Republic. We're in the middle of a spectacular military campaign where we have our heroic men and women fighting this war for us, allied with our closest ally, the Israelis and their military and their great prime minister. President Trump deserves our support. He's doing the right thing. Khomeini's dead. That regime needs to go. No more threats about nuclear weapons. No more terrorism coming out of Iran. It'll come from other places. The geopolitical effects of all this. China is going to be significantly limited in what it can do because of the cutoff of oil to them, the cutoff of oil to them from Venezuela. This has a huge impact on the ability of the Chinese military to do what Xi wants it to do. Huge impact. And so this is very, very important. And freedom for 92 million human beings who are basically Westerners. They're Persians, with whom we were friends for hundreds of years before. This is all to the good. All wars are difficult. All wars have casualties. But think of the alternative. If that regime had nuclear weapons, which it almost did. One other thing. I don't mean to overwhelm you. Take a listen to my interview with Steve Witkoff, the envoy, along with Jared Kushner, dealing with these barbarians in negotiations. I've posted that on my social sites, the full interview. It is stunning, the revelations that he provides and the kind of people he was dealing with and their subterfuge. And they're hiding the ball. which led to the president finally deciding to pull the trigger. It becomes clear the president really did want a deal. It wasn't a head fake. But he realized it wasn't going to happen. He realized that they were on the precipice of doing something awful, and he decided it was time to move. You'll hear that whole story if you check out the Steve Witkoff interview, exclusive, because it was on for about 40 minutes, which you can also find online. So thank you for joining Liberty's Voice. Please spread the word to as many people as you can to view the program. You can view it on Rumble by following us. You can view it on YouTube by subscribing for free. We're going to put it on other platforms as well in the near future. I'll see you next time.